blood tasted like copper and old pennies. Sadie pressed her thumb against the cracked screen of her phone, her vision swimming. Jared had finally crossed the line, ribs splintering, air leaving her lungs. She typed a frantic text to her sister, begging for the police, begging for help. Hit send. She didn't know her finger slipped on the final digit. She didn't know the phone, buzzing on the other end, belonged to a man who painted the city red. Wait right there. The linoleum floor of the bathroom was freezing. Sadie kept her cheek pressed against the cheap peeling tiles, letting the cold seep into her bruised skin. Breathing wasn't something she did automatically anymore. It was a conscious, agonizing effort. In, out. A sharp, hot knife twisted in her right side with every intake of air. Jared was in the living room. She could hear the heavy thud of his work boots dropping to the hardwood, followed by the metallic hiss of a beer can opening. He always drank after. It was his ritual. He'd explode, tear the apartment apart, use her as a punching bag, and then he'd sit on the couch and drink until he passed out. Sadie clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle a whimper. Her ribs weren't just bruised this time. Something was broken. She shifted her weight, and a sickening pop resonated in her chest, sending a wave of nausea straight to her throat. She dry heaved, squeezing her eyes shut. Her phone lay 3 feet away, kicked under the clawfoot tub during the struggle. She needed to move. She needed to reach it. Dragging herself across the floor felt like trying to move underwater. Every muscle screamed. She hooked her fingers around the cracked edge of the phone and pulled it to her chest. The screen was spiderwebbed, the backlight glaring harshly against the dim bathroom lighting. She opened her messages. Her vision was blurring black spots, dancing in her peripheral. She tapped on the conversation thread at the very top. Her sister Clara. They had just been texting that morning about a grocery run. Her hands shook violently. She missed the letters backspaced, typed again. He broke my ribs. I can't breathe. Please call 911. I'm in the bathroom. He has a gun on the table. Hurry. She hit send. What Sadie didn't realize through the haze of concussion and pain was that she hadn't opened Clara's thread. In her panicked, shaking state, she had hit new message. She had typed Clara's number from memory, area code 559. But her thumb slipped. She hit an 8. Miles away in a soundproofed back room of a high-end import warehouse, Matteo Vanzetti was staring at a man who owed him a very large sum of money. The room smelled of cigar smoke and damp concrete. Matteo wasn't yelling. He rarely yelled. He sat in a leather chair, his suit jacket unbuttoned, rolling a heavy silver lighter between his knuckles. You told me Thursday. Matteo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. It is now Monday. The weekend didn't magically erase the debt, Frank. Frank sweat through his collar. Mr. Vanzetti, I swear to God the shipment got held up at the docks. Matteo's phone vibrated against the glass table. He ignored it. Carlos or Matteo said, not taking his eyes off Frank. Break his left hand. Carlo, a man built like a freight train, stepped forward. Frank started screaming before Carlo even touched him. The phone vibrated again. And again. A rapid succession of buzzes indicating an emergency bypass. Matteo frowned. Only 3 people had this private number. He held up a hand. Carlo stopped Frank's finger still gripped in his massive fist. Matteo picked up the phone. It was an unknown number. He swiped open the screen. He broke my ribs. I can't breathe. Please call 911. I'm in the bathroom. He has a gun on the table. Hurry. Matteo stared at the glowing letters. The grammar was frantic. The terror was palpable. It wasn't a code. It wasn't a setup. You didn't fake that kind of raw, desperate panic. Somebody was dying on the other end of this line. He should ignore it. It was a wrong number, a civilian problem, but something about the words caught in his throat. He broke my ribs. He looked at Frank, who was pathetic and cowering. Matteo despised men who used force on things that couldn't fight back. He despised bullies. Matteo tapped the screen. "Who is this?" In the freezing bathroom, Sadie felt the phone buzz. She blinked through the blood leaking from her eyebrow. "Who is this?" She sobbed a choked, wet sound. Why was Clara asking that? "It's Sadie. Please, I'm at 42 B Elm Street. Ground floor. He's drinking. He'll kill me when he comes in." Matteo read the address. Elm Street. It was 5 minutes away. Deep in his territory. The slums. He stood up. The heavy legs of his leather chair scraped against the concrete. Carlo looked back at him, confused. "Put Frank in the holding room," Matteo said, slipping his phone into his inside pocket. He buttoned his suit jacket. "Boss," Carlo asked, "we're not finishing this." "Change of plans," Matteo said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We're taking a ride." Matteo walked out into the humid night air, pulling his phone out one last time. He typed 2 words, his thumb pressing hard against the glass. "Wait, right there." 10 minutes passed. To Sadie it felt like 10 hours. The silence in the apartment was heavier than the noise. Jared had stopped moving around. The TV was mumbling a late-night infomercial. He was either asleep or waiting. Sometimes he waited. He'd sit in the dark, staring at the bathroom door, waiting for her to try and sneak out. Sadie hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The text had said, "Wait right there." It didn't say the cops are coming. It didn't sound like Clara. Rain started to patter against the frosted window above the tub. A steady, rhythmic drumming. Then she heard the engine. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a police cruiser. It was a deep, guttural purr of a heavy engine rolling to a slow stop outside her apartment window. Car doors opened and closed. Not slammed. Shut with quiet, deliberate precision. Footsteps on the gravel. Heavy. Multiple people. Sadie held her breath. The pain in her ribs flared a jagged spike of agony, but she didn't dare exhale. Inside the living room, the springs of the couch creaked. Jared had heard it too. "Who the hell is out there?" Jared slurred his voice, thick with alcohol and rage. She heard his heavy footsteps moving toward the front door. He was going for the gun. She had left it on the kitchen island. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp, polite raps on the front door. "Go away," Jared barked. "Wrong house." Silence, only the rain. Then the world exploded. The solid oak front door didn't just open. It gave way with a deafening crack, the deadbolt tearing entirely through the wooden frame. Sadie screamed, pressing her hands over her ears as the sound reverberated through the tiny apartment. "What the fuck?" Jared yelled. Gun on the table. A calm, chillingly smooth voice said. "Carlo." There was a sickening thud, followed by the clatter of heavy metal hitting the floorboards. A man gasped for air, Jared. He sounded like a fish pulled out of water. "You come into my house." Jared choked out, struggling. "I'll kill you. I'll—" Smuck. It was the sound of bone meeting flesh. Jared went entirely silent. A heavy body dropped to the floor like a sack of wet cement. Sadie trembled violently. The police didn't act like this. They didn't break down doors without shouting, "Police!" They didn't silence people with a single brutal hit. Heavy measured footsteps approached the hallway. They stopped outside the bathroom door. Sadie backed up against the tub, her heart hammering wildly against her broken ribs. She searched blindly for something, anything to defend herself. A toilet brush. A half-empty bottle of bleach. The brass doorknob turned. The door swung inward. The man standing in the doorway didn't look like a savior. He looked like an executioner. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a bespoke black suit that seemed to absorb the dim light. Water clung to his dark hair, and his eyes, a cold, piercing brown, swept the tiny bathroom before landing on her. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her. He saw the blood crusting over her eye, the awkward, protective way she held her torso, the sheer, primal terror radiating from her shaking frame. Matteo's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked near his ear. He had seen violence. He lived in it. But the sight of this woman, bruised and backed into a corner like a hunted animal, stoked a quiet, lethal fire in his chest. "Sadie?" he asked. His voice was completely different from the one that had ordered his man in the living room. It was lower, quieter. She couldn't speak. She just stared at him, her chest heaving, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting clean tracks through the dirt and blood on her cheeks. Matteo slowly crouched down, mindful of his height in the cramped space. He kept his hands visible. "You texted me," he said. He pulled his phone from his pocket and laid it on the floor between them. The screen was lit up, showing her desperate message. "You had the wrong number." Sadie looked at the phone, then up at him. The reality of her mistake crashed over her. She hadn't called the police. She had called a stranger who had just kicked down a reinforced door and neutralized Jared in 3 seconds flat. "Who?" she croaked, her throat raw. "Who are you?" "My name is Matteo," he said. He reached out, stopping a few inches from her shoulder, offering his hand rather than grabbing her. "Can you walk?" "My ribs," she whispered. I think they're in pieces." Matteo nodded once. "I'm going to pick you up. It's going to hurt. But I will be as fast as I can. Do you understand?" She didn't have a choice. She looked at his hand, then at his eyes. There was a dangerous edge to him, a violence that clung to him like cologne, but looking at her, his eyes held a strange, rigid gentleness. She gave a small nod. Matteo moved in. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, taking extreme care to spread his fingers wide to distribute the pressure across her spine rather than her ribs. He stood up in one fluid, powerful motion. Sadie bit through her bottom lip to stop from screaming. White-hot pain flared through her torso. She buried her face into the lapel of his expensive suit, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket. He smelled like cedar wood rain and faint cigar smoke. Matteo carried her out of the bathroom. As they passed through the living room, Sadie cracked her eyes open. Jared was on his knees. His face was a bloody, unrecognizable mess. A man built like a tank, Carlo had a hand firmly gripping the back of Jared's neck, keeping him pinned to the floor. Jared looked up, his one unswollen eye fixing on Sadie in Matteo's arms. "Sadie," Jared gurgled, spitting a tooth onto the floor. "You bitch, you're dead. I'm gonna find you." Matteo stopped walking. He didn't turn around. He didn't even look at Jared. "Carlo Matteo," said the cold, smooth voice, returning. "Yeah, boss. He likes breaking ribs," Matteo said quietly. "Show him what it feels like." Matteo carried Sadie out the front door. Before they reached the porch, the wet, sickening sound of a heavy boot connecting with bone echoed from inside the apartment, followed by a scream that got swallowed by the rain. The rain hit Sadie's face cold and sharp. Matteo didn't run, but his strides were long and purposeful. He carried her down the concrete steps and across the cracked sidewalk toward a massive black SUV idling by the curb. The engine rumbled with a deep, vibrating hum. Another man in a dark suit was waiting by the back door. He pulled it open as Matteo approached, his eyes briefly, flicking to Sadie before staring straight ahead, expressionless. "Hospital boss?" the driver asked. "No," Matteo said, sliding into the back seat and carefully settling Sadie onto the plush leather. "Dr. Evans, call ahead. Tell him we need a trauma room prepped 5 minutes ago." "Yes, boss." The door slammed shut, sealing them inside. The interior of the SUV was silent, heavily soundproofed against the storm outside. The windows were tinted, pitch black. Sadie lay on her side across the wide seat, her head resting near Matteo's thigh. She couldn't stop shaking. Adrenaline was crashing, leaving nothing but a vast, consuming sea of pain. She looked up at him. Matteo was staring out the window, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. His jaw was set in a hard, unyielding line. "Why?" Sadie started coughing immediately. The cough ripped through her chest, making her curl inward with a whimper. Matteo's hand hovered over her hesitant, before lightly resting on her uninjured shoulder. It was a grounding weight. "Don't speak," he said. "Save your breath. Evans will give you something for the pain soon." "Why didn't you call the police?" She forced out the words, scraping against her teeth. Matteo looked down at her. The shadows in the car made his dark eyes look completely hollow. "Police file reports. They ask questions. They let men like that post bail the next morning." He brushed a damp strand of hair away from her bruised eye. "I don't post bail." A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the wet clothes clinging to her skin. She had traded a domestic monster for a professional one. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who answers his texts," Matteo replied smoothly, turning his gaze back to the window. The SUV took hard, fast turns, blowing through red lights. The driver never hit the brakes, laying on the horn, and weaving through the slick city streets with terrifying precision. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the nausea. 10 minutes later, the SUV dove down a concrete ramp into an underground parking garage. The tires screeched as they halted abruptly. The doors flew open. Matteo was out in a second, reaching in to lift her again. The movement jarred her, and a sharp cry escaped her lips. "I've got you. I've got you." Matteo muttered, his voice entirely devoid of the coldness he used with his men. It was a low, urgent murmur. He carried her through a set of heavy steel double doors and down a sterile, brightly lit hallway. This wasn't a hospital. There were no nurses rushing around, no paging systems overhead. It was quiet, clinical, private. A man in a white coat came jogging down the hall, slipping a stethoscope around his neck. He looked tired, his graying hair messy. "Matteo," Dr. Evans said, his eyes darting to Sadie. "Bring her in here. Bed 3. Matteo carried her into a small, immaculately clean trauma room and gently lowered her onto the examination table. The overhead lights were blinding. Sadie turned her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "What are we looking at?" Dr. Evans asked, pulling on blue latex gloves. "Blunt force trauma," Matteo said, stepping back to give the doctor room. "Ribs on the right side. Laceration above the left eye. Possible concussion. She's struggling to pull air." Dr. Evans moved in quickly. "Miss, I need to cut your shirt open to examine your chest. Is that all right?" Sadie nodded frantically. She just wanted the pain to stop. The cold metal of medical shears slid against her skin. The fabric of her ruined T-shirt gave way. She heard Dr. Evans hiss through his teeth. "Extensive bruising. I feel crepitus." The doctor muttered his fingers lightly, expertly pressing against her side. Sadie gasped, her back arching off the table. "Hold still. I know. I'm sorry. Matteo, get the ultrasound. Let's make sure she hasn't punctured a lung." Matteo moved without a word, pushing a cart over. He wasn't leaving the room. Sadie realized he hadn't taken his eyes off her. "Lung looks clear," Dr. Evans said, a minute later, staring at a monitor. "No internal bleeding in the pleural cavity. You're lucky. 2 clean fractures, 1 hairline. But they haven't displaced inward." "Painkillers," Matteo demanded quietly. "Drawing them up now," Dr. Evans said, turning to a metal tray. "Morphine push. It's going to hit you fast, sweetheart." He found a vein in her arm. The pinch of the needle was nothing compared to the agony in her chest. Seconds later, a cool rush washed up her arm, blooming into a heavy, warm fog behind her eyes. The sharp edges of the room began to blur. The agonizing knife in her side dulled into a heavy, distant ache. Her breathing slowed, no longer hitched with panic, She turned her head sluggishly toward the corner of the room. Matteo was standing there, leaning against the pale wall. His suit jacket was ruined, stained with her blood where she had pressed against him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, heavy and dark. "You didn't have to come." Sadie mumbled the morphine, making her tongue thick and clumsy. Matteo crossed the room, stopping at the edge of her bed. He looked down at her battered face. "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "Why?" Matteo reached out his knuckles, lightly grazing the unbruised side of her jaw. It was a terrifyingly gentle touch from a man whose hands were built for violence. Because a world where a woman bleeds on a bathroom floor while a dog drinks in the next room, Matteo whispered, "is not a world I tolerate." Sadie's eyes grew heavy. The drugs pulled her down into the dark. But right before she slipped under, she realized she wasn't afraid of the monster in the room. She was entirely inexplicably safe with him. Waking up was a slow, punishing process. It wasn't like the movies where the heroine blinks open her eyes, looks around, and immediately jumps out of bed. Sadie clawed her way up through a thick, suffocating layer of chemical sleep. Her eyelids felt like they were lined with lead. Her mouth was dry, coated in a stale metallic film. First came the sound, the low rhythmic hum of a central air conditioning unit, not the rattling window unit of her apartment. This was the quiet, expensive kind of cold. Then came the feeling. She was sinking into a mattress that yielded perfectly to her weight, enveloped in sheets so soft they felt like water against her skin. But the comfort was a brutal contrast to the rigid, binding pressure wrapped around her torso. She took a breath, a shallow one. Pain, dull but profoundly deep, radiated from her right side. The morphine had worn off, replaced by something less absolute, but still heavily sedating. She shifted her left arm, feeling the sharp pull of an IV taped to the back of her hand. Sadie forced her eyes open. The room was vast, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows, obscured by heavy slate-grey blackout curtains. Only a sliver of weak morning light pierced the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing over a dark mahogany dresser. The walls were painted a muted charcoal, minimalist, cold, impeccably clean. She wasn't in a hospital. She wasn't in her apartment. She was in a fortress. Panic, sharp and cold, spiked in her chest. She tried to sit up. The broken ribs protested instantly, locking her muscles in a vicious spasm that stole her breath. She gasped, falling back against the pillows, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. "Don't do that," the voice came from the darkest corner of the room. Sadie's head snapped to the right. A man was sitting in a low armchair, his legs crossed, a tablet resting on his knee. The screen cast a pale blue glow over his face. Matteo. He wasn't wearing the blood-stained suit from last night. He wore dark slacks and a black, long-sleeved Henley that stretched tight across his chest and shoulders. He looked less like a corporate executive and more like a soldier waiting out a siege. He set the tablet on a side table and stood up. He moved with a terrifying lack of sound for a man his size. "You've been asleep for 14 hours. Matteo said, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded the quiet room. He walked over to the side of the bed, pouring a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the nightstand. "Evans, set your ribs. You have 2 fractures. You are wrapped, and you are heavily medicated, but you will still feel it if you try to move too quickly." He held the glass out. Sadie just stared at it, then at him. Her mind raced, trying to bridge the gap between the bloody bathroom floor and this high-end prison. The memory of Jared's face, bruised and bleeding, flashed behind her eyes. The sound of a boot breaking bone. "Where am I?" she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. "My guest house," Matteo replied calmly. He didn't retract the glass. He waited. Sadie looked at the water. The thirst was unbearable. She reached out with her free, un-IV-hooked hand. Her fingers trembled violently. Before she could take the glass, Matteo's large hand wrapped around hers, steadying the tremor. His skin was warm, his grip firm but careful. He guided the rim to her lips. She drank greedy, desperate swallows. It tasted like absolute heaven. When she finished, he pulled the glass away and set it down. He didn't step back immediately. He stood over her, his dark eyes analyzing her face. Looking for shock. Looking for hysteria. My sister Sadie croaked, panic bubbling up again. Clara, the text. She thinks I'm missing. She'll call the police. She'll go to the apartment. She won't, Matteo said. He crossed his arms. I sent a message from your phone 3 hours after I brought you here. I told her you and Jared had a massive fight, that you packed a bag and took a bus to a friend's place upstate to cool off for a few weeks. I told her you lost your charger and you'd call when you settled. Sadie stared at him, horror mingling with awe. You lied to her. I bought you time, he corrected smoothly. If your sister went to that apartment today, she would have found the front door splintered into kindling and a significant amount of blood on the living room floor. Then she would have called the police. Then the police would be looking for you and looking for Jared. Sadie swallowed hard. Where is Jared? Matteo's expression didn't shift. Not a muscle twitched. Jared is no longer a factor in your life. The finality in his tone sent a chill straight down to her marrow. No longer a factor. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of completed fact. Did you kill him? She asked. The bluntness of her own question surprised her. She didn't feel hysterical. She felt entirely hollow. I don't answer questions that force me to lie to you, Matteo said. It was an evasion, but it was an honest one. He won't breathe your air again. He won't touch you again. That is the only piece of information you need to process right now. Sadie looked away, staring at the sterile white tape holding the IV to her skin. A man was dead, or as good as dead, because she slipped on a touch screen, because her thumb hit an 8 instead of a 9. I don't have money, Sadie said, quietly staring at the blanket. I don't have anything of value. I'm a shift manager at a coffee roaster. My bank account has $300 in it. Whatever you think I can give you for this, I can't. Matteo let out a short, quiet exhale. It wasn't a laugh, but it was close. I don't want your money, Sadie. Then what do you want? Her eyes snapped back to him, cynical and hard. Men didn't do things for nothing. Men didn't kick down doors, pay off private doctors, and offer up luxury guest houses out of the goodness of their hearts. The world didn't work like that. The world was transactional. Jared hit her because he wanted control. Matteo saved her because he wanted... What? Matteo held her gaze. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a stray dog expecting a kick even when a hand is offering food. I want you to heal, Matteo said, his voice dropping a register, losing its clinical detachment. I want you to breathe without it feeling like shattered glass in your chest. I want you to sleep without keeping one eye on the door. He leaned closer, resting both hands on the footboard of the bed. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. You called me Sadie. In my world, when someone asks for help, and I answer, I take responsibility for the outcome. I am seeing this through. You are going to stay here until Evans clears you. You will eat what my chef makes. You will sleep. You will let the bone knit. And if I say no, she challenged, though her voice shook. If I want to walk out that door, Matteo didn't blink. You wouldn't make it to the end of the driveway before passing out. But if you truly want to leave, I will have my driver drop you anywhere you ask. You are not a prisoner here. You are a guest. But if you leave, You walk back into a world that let a man break your ribs on a bathroom floor while neighbors turned up their televisions to ignore the screaming. He paused, letting the harsh truth settle over her. "Here," Matteo said softly, "nobody ignores a scream." The next 3 days were a blur of regimented healing. Sadie learned quickly that Matteo Vanzetti did not operate on suggestions. He operated on schedules. A woman named Rosa, an older Italian woman with iron-grey hair and a deeply maternal no-nonsense demeanor, arrived every morning at 7. She brought painkillers, fresh bandages, and trays of nutrient-dense food. Bone broth, sliced steak, spinach, food designed to rebuild tissue and bone. Rosa didn't ask questions about how Sadie got her injuries. She simply clucked her tongue, muttered in Italian, and made sure Sadie ate every last bite. Matteo was a ghost during the daylight hours. Sadie would hear the heavy rumble of his SUV leaving the estate early in the morning and returning long after the sun had set. By the 4th day, the intense fog of the painkillers began to lift, replaced by an acute, restless boredom. The pain in her ribs had shifted from a blinding stab to a heavy, constant, deep-tissue ache. It was manageable as long as she moved like an octogenarian. She finally managed to drag herself out of bed without Rosa's help. She walked into the adjoining bathroom, bracing her good hand against the marble vanity. She looked in the mirror and flinched. The laceration above her left eyebrow had been expertly stitched, a neat black line of thread stark against her pale skin. The skin around her eye had bloomed into a horrific collage of deep purple, sickly yellow and mottled green. She looked like she had been in a car wreck. Carefully, agonizingly, she unbuttoned the oversized silk pajama top Rosa had provided. She inspected her right side. A wide, tight compression brace wrapped around her rib cage. Above and below the white fabric, her skin was completely black and blue. She touched a dark purple bruise on her collarbone. Jared had done that. He had shoved her into the doorframe before he started hitting her. A heavy wave of anger, thick and suffocating, washed over her. Not at Jared, at herself. For staying, for believing the apologies, for thinking she could manage the monster if she just kept the apartment clean enough, if she just stayed quiet enough. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back aggressively. Crying hurt her chest, and she was done crying over Jared. She buttoned the shirt, washed her face, and slowly made her way out of the bedroom. The guest house was an architectural marvel. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked a massive manicured lawn surrounded by dense old-growth trees. A high stone wall, topped with subtle but distinct iron spikes, encircled the entire property. She saw 2 men in dark suits walking the perimeter. Security. Guards. She walked into the sleek modern kitchen. Rosa was gone for the day. Sadie opened the industrial-sized refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of sparkling water. As she turned around, she jumped. Matteo was standing in the doorway. He wore a dark charcoal suit, the tie already discarded, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a faint smear of something that looked suspiciously like dried blood near his cuff. "You're up," he noted, his eyes tracking her movement. He didn't look surprised, just observant. "I'm tired of staring at the ceiling," Sadie said. She twisted the cap off the water bottle. The effort pulled at her ribs, and she sucked in a sharp breath, her posture stiffening. Matteo crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides. He took the bottle from her hands, effortlessly twisted the cap the rest of the way off, and handed it back. "Pride will slow your healing," he said dryly. "I'm used to doing things myself," Sadie shot back, taking a sip. "You're used to surviving," Matteo corrected. He leaned against the marble island, watching her. "There's a difference," Sadie bristled. "You don't know me. You know what you saw for 5 minutes in a bathroom." "I know what a victim looks like," Matteo said. His voice wasn't cruel, it was clinical. factual. I also know what a survivor looks like. You survived, but you're angry. You're angry that you needed me. Sadie gripped the cold bottle tightly. I'm angry that I let him do it. I'm angry that I stayed long enough for him to break my bones. And yes, I'm angry that my safety now depends on a man who casually mentions that my abuser won't breathe my air again. She stared at him, daring him to flinch. He didn't. You want me to apologize for handling a problem that the law would have ignored? Matteo asked, tilting his head. I don't even know what you do, Sadie said, her voice dropping, the fight draining out of her. You kick down doors. You have armed guards. You have doctors on payroll. What are you, Matteo? Matteo looked down at the marble counter. He traced a vein in the stone with his index finger. The silence stretched heavy and tense. I manage commodities, he said finally. Sometimes those commodities are legal. Sometimes they bypass taxation. Often I deal with men who do not respect contracts. When men do not respect contracts, I ensure they respect consequences. You're a criminal. It wasn't a question. Matteo looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I am a man who operates outside a broken system. The police protect property, Sadie. I protect my people. I'm not your people, she whispered. You dialed my number. Matteo said, his gaze unwavering, pinning her in place. The universe, God, fate, whatever you want to call it, routed your panic to my phone. From the second I walked through your splintered door, you became my responsibility. You are under my roof. You eat my food. You are protected by my men. He stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight. You are my people now, Sadie, whether you like it or not. Sleep remained a luxury Sadie couldn't afford. The morphine was gone, replaced by standard ibuprofen that barely took the edge off the deep ache in her side. But it wasn't just the pain keeping her awake. It was the silence. For 2 years, silence in Jared's apartment meant danger. It meant he was stewing. It meant an explosion was imminent. Her nervous system was permanently wired to interpret quiet as a threat. At 2 a.m. on her 6th night in the guest house, Sadie gave up trying to sleep. She threw off the heavy duvet, gritting her teeth against the stiffness in her ribs, and pulled on a thick grey cashmere cardigan she had found in the closet. The house was cold at night. She walked quietly out of the bedroom, padding barefoot across the hardwood floors. She didn't turn on any lights. The moonlight spilling through the massive windows provided enough illumination to navigate the minimalist furniture. She planned to go to the kitchen for warm milk, a trick Clara had taught her years ago. But as she passed the long hallway leading to the back of the house, she saw a sliver of golden light leaking from beneath a heavy oak door. Matteo's study. She hesitated. She had strict boundaries here, mostly self-imposed. She stayed in her designated areas. But the insomnia, paired with a gnawing, dangerous curiosity about the man who held her life in his hands, pushed her forward. She walked to the door. It wasn't completely latched. She pushed it open an inch. The study was lined with books, real leather-bound books that smelled of old paper and dust. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Matteo was sitting behind it. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt that clung to his broad chest, a pair of dark sweatpants. He looked utterly human. He was wearing reading glasses, sleek, black-rimmed frames that softened the sharp, lethal angles of his face. He was poring over a ledger, a pen spinning absent-mindedly between his fingers. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat next to a stack of manila folders. Sadie watched him for a long moment. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a very dark world on his shoulders. Suddenly, without looking up, Matteo spoke. "If you stand in the draft much longer, you're going to catch a cold on top of the broken ribs." Sadie froze. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room. "How did you know I was there?" she asked, wrapping the cardigan tighter around herself. Matteo took off his glasses, tossing them onto the desk, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I hear everything that happens in this house. You walk heavily on your left foot to compensate for the pain on your right side." He gestured to one of the leather wingback chairs opposite his desk. "Sit." Sadie slowly lowered herself into the chair, perching on the edge. The leather was cold against her bare legs. "Can't sleep?" he asked, pouring a splash of whiskey into a second glass. He slid it across the desk toward her. Sadie looked at the amber liquid. "I shouldn't mix that with ibuprofen. A splash won't kill you. It'll numb the nerve endings." She hesitated, then picked up the glass. She took a tiny sip. It burned like liquid fire down her throat, settling into a heavy warmth in her stomach. "The silence is too loud," she admitted, quietly staring into the glass. "I keep waiting for a door to slam." Matteo leaned back in his chair. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her she was safe now that the bad man was gone. He knew trauma didn't work like that. "When I was 19, Matteo started his voice, a low, gravelly murmur in the quiet room. "My father was murdered, shot in the chest in a restaurant while eating veal." Sadie looked up, startled by the sudden vulnerability. "For 3 years after that," Matteo continued, "I couldn't eat in public. If a waiter dropped a tray, my hand was on a gun. If a car backfired, I was on the floor. Violence rewires your brain, Sadie. It installs a permanent alarm system. It takes a long time to figure out how to lower the volume." Sadie studied him. "How did you lower yours?" "I didn't," he said bluntly. "I just became the thing that caused the alarm." It was a bleak, cynical admission. A confession of a man who had embraced the darkness rather than trying to escape it. "Why did you really come for me, Matteo?" She asked the question that had been eating at her since the first night, finally spilling out. "Don't tell me it's because I dialed your number. Men like you don't care about collateral damage. You don't play white knight." Matteo looked at his glass, swirling the whiskey slowly. The ice clinked against the crystal. "I believe in balance," he said quietly. "Karma, the scales. In my line of work, I put a lot of ugliness into the world. I ruin men. I break things. I command violence." He looked up, meeting her eyes. The intensity in his gaze pinned her to the chair. "When your text came through," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "I was standing in a room, ordering a man's hand to be broken over a debt. I was the monster in the room." Sadie held her breath. She could picture it vividly. The cold, ruthless authority he commanded. "I read your message," Matteo continued, "and I realized I had an opportunity to balance the scale. For one night, I didn't have to be the monster putting terror into the world. I could be the monster that killed the terror." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I didn't save you because I'm a good man, Sadie. I'm not. I saved you because I needed to prove to myself that my hands could still stop a bleeding wound instead of just creating one." Sadie stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated honesty of it stripped away her cynicism. He wasn't playing a savior. He was using her to absolve his own sins just as much as she was using him to survive. It was a transaction, but it was a deeply human one. "Did it work?" she whispered. Matteo looked at her battered face, the dark bruises fading to a sickly yellow, the tight set of her shoulders as she guarded her broken bones. "I don't know yet," he said softly, "but nobody will ever break your ribs again. That scale is permanently balanced." For the first time since she had arrived at the compound, Sadie felt the tight, suffocating knot of panic in her chest loosen just a fraction. She took another sip of the whiskey. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time, she truly meant it. Matteo just nodded, turning his attention back to his ledger. "Go to sleep, Sadie. The door is locked. The guards are awake. The monster is working. You are safe. 3 weeks passed. The bones knitted. Healing wasn't poetic. It was an annoying, deeply physical inconvenience. The sharp, breathtaking agony in Sadie's ribs downgraded to a persistent, dull throb, accompanied by an intense, beneath-the-skin itch that she couldn't scratch through the tight, elastic compression wrap. The horrific yellow and green bruising around her eye faded into a faint, yellowish smudge. She could breathe deeply now. She tested it every morning, filling her lungs to capacity just to feel the expansion. It didn't hurt. It just felt tight. On the 22nd day, she demanded to see Clara. Matteo didn't argue. He didn't lock her away. He simply nodded, pulled his phone out, and arranged a venue. They met at a bustling, aggressively brightly lit breakfast diner on the edge of the financial district. It was loud, filled with the clatter of porcelain plates and the sharp chatter of corporate analysts on their morning breaks. A neutral zone. Sadie sat in a red vinyl booth near the back. 3 tables away, Carlo sat alone, his massive frame awkwardly squeezed into a booth meant for 2 eating a plate of scrambled eggs with his right hand, while his left rested casually near his waistband. The bell above the diner door jingled. Clara walked in. She looked frantic, wearing her coat, unbuttoned her hair, pulled back into a messy claw clip. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Sadie. Sadie. Clara practically threw herself across the table, wrapping her arms around Sadie's neck. Sadie braced her core, absorbing the impact. She winced slightly, but she didn't push her sister away. She buried her face in Clara's shoulder, smelling her familiar lavender detergent. It anchored her. "You look—" Clara pulled back her eyes, dropping to the faint yellow bruise above Sadie's eye, then scanning her posture. "You look different." "I'm okay," Sadie said smoothly. It wasn't entirely a lie anymore. A text message, Sadie. "You send me a text saying you're going upstate, and then your phone goes straight to voicemail for 3 weeks. Clara's voice trembled, a mix of profound relief and sisterly fury. "I was going out of my mind. I went to the police." Sadie's stomach dropped. The vinyl seat felt suddenly very slippery. "You went to the cops. They wouldn't take a missing persons report, because you texted me saying you left voluntarily," Clara said bitterly, stirring 3 packets of sugar into her coffee. "But 2 days ago, a detective called me. They asked if I had heard from Jared." Sadie kept her face completely blank. She had practiced this in the bathroom mirror at the guest house. "Don't blink too fast. Keep your hands on the warm coffee mug to stop them from shaking." "Why were they asking about Jared?" "He vanished," Clara whispered, leaning across the table. "His landlord filed an abandonment notice. His truck was found parked near a long-term lot at the bus terminal, but his tools were still inside. The cops think he skipped town because he owed money to some really dangerous people." Clara reached out, grabbing Sadie's hands. "Did he hit you again before you left? Is that why you ran? Did those people come after him?" Sadie looked past Clara's shoulder. Carlo was chewing his toast, staring blankly at a wall clock. He didn't look like a man who participated in making human beings vanish. He looked like an accountant who lifted heavy weights. "He won't breathe your air again." Matteo's words echoed in her skull. It hadn't been a metaphor. It hadn't been a warning. It was logistics. "We had a fight," Sadie said, her voice steady low and completely convincing. He threw a bottle. It missed, but it shattered against the wall. I realized I was going to die in that apartment if I stayed. So I grabbed my purse and walked out. Clara squeezed her fingers. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so glad you ran. I'm so glad you're safe. Where are you staying? Let me come see your place." "You can't," Sadie said. Clara blinked. "Why?" "Because the people I'm staying with." Sadie hesitated. She looked at her sister, sweet, normal, law-abiding Clara, who worried about credit scores and dental insurance. If Clara knew the truth, she becomes an accessory. she becomes leverage. They value privacy. I'm safe, Clara. For the first time in 2 years, I sleep through the night. Just let me have this for a little longer. Clara studied her. She saw the rigid set of Sadie's jaw. She saw that the shrinking, apologetic girl who used to make excuses for Jared's bruised knuckles was gone, replaced by someone remarkably cold, remarkably quiet. "Okay," Clara whispered softly. "Just don't disappear on me again." When the lunch ended, Clara hugged her once more and walked out into the chilly autumn air. Sadie watched her through the plate-glass window until she disappeared into the pedestrian crowd. Carlo slid into the booth opposite her, dropping a $20 bill onto the table to cover the check. "You handled that well," Carlo said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I lied to the only person in the world who loves me," Sadie said, staring at the cold dregs of her coffee. "You kept her out of a room she doesn't belong in," Carlo corrected, simply standing up. "Let's go. Boss is waiting." The SUV didn't head back to the gated compound. Instead, it navigated the crumbling asphalt of the industrial district, pulling into the subterranean garage of Matteo's primary warehouse. Sadie stepped out onto the concrete. The air smelled of motor oil, raw tobacco, and damp brick. Matteo was waiting near a heavy hydraulic lift. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore faded jeans and a dark grey work shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with dense muscle and faded, jagged scars. He was wiping grease from a heavy wrench with a red rag. He looked at her as she approached. His eyes swept her face, reading the residual emotional fallout from her lunch with Clara. "She believed you?" Matteo asked. "She thinks Jared ran away from loan sharks," Sadie said, stopping 5 feet from him. The sheer physical gravity of the man always made her pause. "She thinks I'm safe." "You are safe." "Am I?" Sadie crossed her arms, mindful of her ribs. "The police are asking questions, Matteo. They found his truck." Matteo tossed the wrench onto a metal workbench. The sharp clack echoed in the cavernous garage. "They found a truck parked legally at a transit hub," Matteo said calmly. "There is no blood in it. There is no body. In 3 months, the file will move to a cold desk. In a year, it will be archived. The police do not waste resources hunting for domestic abusers who voluntarily disappear." He stepped toward her, tossing the greasy rag onto the bench. "I need to go to the apartment," Sadie said suddenly. Matteo stopped. His dark eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "My birth certificate, my social security card, my mother's wedding band. I hid them inside the air vent in the bedroom closet so Jared couldn't pawn them. If the landlord clears the unit, they'll be thrown out. I need them." Matteo studied her for a long, silent moment. He didn't ask if she was emotionally ready to see the crime scene of her own life. He calculated the risk. Carlo Matteo called out without looking back. "Bring the sedan, not the SUV." 10 minutes later, they pulled up to 42B Elm Street. The neighborhood looked grayscaled under the overcast sky. Trash blew across the cracked sidewalks. The heavy oak front door of her old apartment had been replaced by a cheap, unpainted sheet of plywood, secured with a padlock. The landlord's temporary fix. Matteo stepped out of the driver's seat. He didn't use a key. He produced a short, flat pry bar from his jacket, wedged it behind the padlock hardware, and jerked his shoulder once. The cheap screws tore out of the plywood with a dry screech. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, first, clearing the room. Sadie followed him over the threshold. The smell hit her instantly, stale beer mildew, old cigarette smoke, and the faint, unmistakable copper tang of dried blood. The living room was stripped bare. The cheap couch was gone. But on the faded beige carpet right in front of the TV stand was a massive, irregular, dark brown stain. Jared's blood. Sadie froze. Her breath hitched. The ghost of the pain flared in her right side, the phantom sensation of a work boot driving into her ribs. Her vision tunneled. A heavy, warm hand landed firmly on the back of her neck. Matteo. He squeezed slightly, grounding her, pulling her attention away from the bloodstain and up to his face. "Look at me," he commanded quietly. She looked up. His brown eyes were steady, completely devoid of fear. "It's just stained carpet," Matteo said, his voice low and absolute. "He isn't here. He is never going to be here again. Get your things. 5 minutes." Sadie swallowed the dry lump in her throat, nodded, and walked into the bedroom. She pulled the step stool from the corner, reached up into the dusty closet, and popped the metal grate off the air vent. She reached deep inside her fingers, brushing cold metal, until she found the small, taped tin box. She pulled it out, clutching it to her chest. As she stepped down from the stool, she heard a floorboard squeak in the living room. Then a voice, not Matteo's. "Yo, Jared, that you, man." Sadie froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She recognized that voice. Mick. Jared's sleazy petty dealer drinking buddy, who used to crash on their couch and leer at her when Jared was passed out. She crept to the bedroom doorway and peered out. Mick was standing in the center of the living room, wearing a greasy hoodie, holding a crowbar. He had clearly broken in through the back window looking for Jared's leftover stash. He didn't see Matteo, who was standing quietly in the shadows near the kitchen entryway. Mick saw Sadie. Mick's greasy face lit up with a nasty, yellow-toothed grin. "Sadie, damn girl. Everyone said you skipped town. Where's Jared, son of a bitch, owes me $1,200 for that crate of pills?" He took 2 heavy steps toward the bedroom. "You got his stash on you. Or maybe you're going to work off his debt, huh?" Sadie didn't shrink. For 2 years, she would have cowered. She would have apologized. She would have offered him her grocery money just to make him leave. Instead, she stood completely still. She didn't say a word. She just flicked her eyes toward the dark kitchen doorway. Mick didn't even have time to register the movement. Matteo stepped out of the shadow like an apex predator, descending from a tree. There was no theatrical shout. No warning. His left hand shot out, clamping around Mick's throat with the force of an industrial vice, cutting his shout off into a dry, pathetic click. Matteo drove him backward with terrifying kinetic efficiency, slamming Mick's spine hard against the drywall. The crowbar slipped from Mick's numb fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Matteo leaned in. He didn't pull a gun. He just applied pressure to the carotid artery, his face mere inches from Mick's sweating, terrified visage. Matteo's expression was utterly void. Dead eyes. "Jared doesn't live here," Matteo whispered. His voice was quieter than the wind outside, but it carried the absolute weight of a falling guillotine. "Sadie doesn't live here. This address is a graveyard. If I ever see your face on this street again, I will put you under the carpet. Do you nod, or do you bleed?" Mick's eyes bulged, bloodshot, and weeping from lack of oxygen. He managed a frantic, jerky nod. Matteo released him. Mick dropped to his knees, gasping violently, clutching his throat. He didn't look up. He scrambled backward like a crab, kicked the front door open, and sprinted down the porch steps into the grey afternoon. Matteo stood in the empty living room, rolling his shoulders once to loosen the tension. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and calmly wiped his palm where he had touched Mick's neck. He looked over at Sadie. She was standing in the bedroom doorway, holding her mother's tin box. Her heart was racing, but her hands were entirely steady. She looked at the brutal, lethal man standing in the center of her old, terrifying nightmare. She realized then that the scales hadn't just been balanced. The entire architecture of her life had been demolished and rebuilt. She wasn't afraid of the violence anymore, because for the first time in her life, the violence belonged to her. "Got your box?" Matteo asked quietly. "Yeah," Sadie said. "Let's go home." 2 days later, Dr. Evans arrived at the guest house for the final examination. The sterile trauma scissors clipped through the heavy white medical tape. Evans unraveled the wide elastic compression wrap from around Sadie's torso, pulling the heavy fabric away like a cocoon. "Take a breath," Evans instructed, Pressing his cold stethoscope against her back, Sadie inhaled. She pulled air past her throat, filling her upper chest, then her diaphragm expanding her ribcage to its absolute limit. No pain, no sharp, jagged catch, just a deep, clean rush of cold oxygen. "Exhale," Evans said. She let it out in a long, steady stream. "Ribs are solid," Dr. Evans said, packing his stethoscope into his leather bag. "The hairline fracture is completely remodeled. You'll ache when it rains for the next year or two, and I wouldn't recommend taking up kickboxing this month, but medically speaking, you're cleared." He patted her shoulder gently. "Take care of yourself, Sadie." When the doctor left, the guest house fell into a heavy, profound silence. The medical mandate was over. The contract of her recovery was officially fulfilled. She was no longer a patient. She was just a woman standing in a billionaire criminal's guest house wearing borrowed cashmere. She walked into the main living room. Matteo was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the manicured lawn. The autumn trees had shed their leaves, leaving bare, sharp branches scratching against the grey sky. On the glass coffee table sat a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. Sadie walked over and stopped beside it. She looked down. "What's this?" "Your severance," Matteo said. He didn't turn around. He kept his hands in his slacks pockets. Inside is a clean driver's license, a birth certificate, and a passport under the name Sadie Miller. There is a title to a 2-bedroom cottage in Burlington, Vermont, fully paid off through a blind trust. There is a debit card linked to an account with $200,000 in it. Sadie stared at the brown paper. The sheer amount of wealth represented in that envelope was staggering. It was enough to erase her past entirely. It was enough to live quietly, comfortably, safely forever. "You're paying me off," she said. Her voice was flat, cynical. "I am fulfilling my responsibility," Matteo corrected, finally turning to face her. His dark eyes were unreadable, locked behind that familiar, corporate, ruthless mask. "You dialed my number. I stepped into your life. I broke your door and I removed your abuser. I told you I would see it through until you were healed. You are healed." He gestured to the envelope. "A car is idling at the front gate. The driver will take you to the airport or straight to Vermont, whichever you prefer. You will never see me again. You will never have to look over your shoulder again." Sadie didn't touch the envelope. She looked at it, then slowly raised her eyes to his face. "And what happens to you?" she asked. Matteo's jaw tightened. A micro-expression of surprise flickered across his eyes before vanishing. "I go back to work, back to breaking hands, back to managing my world," he said coldly. Sadie took a step toward him. The space between them shrank to less than 2 feet. She didn't look like the broken, bleeding girl on the bathroom tiles anymore. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her breath steady and strong. "You think you're doing the noble thing," Sadie said, her voice dropping into a low, quiet register. "You think you're releasing the captive bird back into the wild. But you're wrong, Matteo." Matteo frowned slightly. "Sadie, I don't want Vermont," she interrupted smoothly. "I don't want a fake name, and I definitely don't want to go back to pretending that the world is a safe, polite place where bad things only happen to other people." She reached out. Her fingers lightly brushed the dark fabric of his Henley, right over his sternum. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart beneath her fingertips. Matteo went completely still. He didn't pull away, but his breathing shifted, shallow, controlled. "Normal people terrified me," Sadie whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. "Normal people heard Jared throwing me against walls and turned up their music. Normal people let me bleed. You are a monster, Matteo. You operate in the dark. But you are the only person in my entire life who looked at my pain and decided it was unacceptable." Matteo's hand came up, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist. He didn't push her away. He held her there against his chest. "If you stay here." Matteo warned, his voice rough scraping like sandpaper. "There is no going back. My world is violent, Sadie. It is unforgiving. I have enemies who would use you to get to me. I cannot promise you peace." "I had peace on Elm Street," Sadie said cynically. "It almost killed me. I don't want peace." She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. She looked at his lethal hands, his scarred forearms, his sharp, ruthless jaw. "I want a shield," she said softly. "And I think you want someone who doesn't look at you like you're a monster." Matteo stared at her. The rigid, unyielding posture he had maintained for 3 weeks finally fractured. He exhaled a long, heavy breath, his forehead dropping down to rest gently against hers. He smelled of cedar rain and dark tobacco. "You texted the wrong number," Matteo murmured against her lips, a grim, grounded surrender in his voice. "No," Sadie whispered, her hands sliding up to frame his jaw. "I didn't." The scales were permanently balanced, and the ledger was closed. What an incredible, gritty journey. Sadie and Matteo proved that sometimes survival isn't about finding a shining hero. It's about finding someone willing to stand in the dark with you. If this grounded, intense romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love dark, realistic storytelling, and hit subscribe with notifications turned on, so you never miss another thrilling drama. Drop a comment below. Did Sadie make the right choice, staying in Matteo's world? I want to hear your thoughts. See you next time.